Hello, this is Dr. John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Prevention Academy, and this is my pre-meeting preview of my presentation at the EFFoST conference, the European Federation of Food Science and Technology, from November 8th, 2022. And the title of the presentation is The Evolution of Food Fraud Vulnerabilities from Melamine to Infinity. So I'm playing a little bit of getting cute with the title there a bit, but just trying to think about the future. And that was something here at the end of 2022, kind of helping companies and organizations look at the next year. This was a good time to look at the future. I love to start with this slide, and I imagine in the room it's going to be interesting when I say counterfeiters attend anti-counterfeit conferences. So especially this conference is a very science and technology focused entity, and so there's a lot of focus on testing and catching and authenticity. And so to think that the fraudsters may actually be listening to our presentations to try to figure ways to get around us or try to avoid getting caught is really novel. And to have the social sciences so involved in part of food science is novel. So the thing that the key is to just to realize that it would be illogical for fraudsters not to be coming to the conferences or reading the proceedings or the papers. So we can complain about it or we can embrace it, we can use it. And one of the things that criminology does include is communicating to the criminals, basically by putting things in place or warnings, different types of prosecution that lead criminals to think twice before they act. That's really truly prevention. So let's get started. First, just real briefly about resources, massive open online courses. That's the main way that we operate. The content is always free. Don't have to pay a thing to start in them. There is a certificate of completion with an administrative fee. There are approximately 10 professional training hours. So we have basics, the overview of food fraud. We have an audit guide for food defense and food fraud. That's real key. At the very first step of companies is just to comply and then to figure out how to get things under control. And that leads into the vulnerability assessment and prevention strategy, or VASIP. Those are the core courses we have. And then we've got some specialty courses that go into more detail. So developing an organic fraud prevention plan, that's with the Organic Trade Association. That's all organic products, not just food. So it gives a little different perspective, but goes much deeper there, and specifically looking at the organic compliance requirements. Food fraud and enterprise risk management, ERM. So, I feel so bad for a lot of people that are doing the projects, because you'll get through this great long guidance document and it will say, well, you decide what's a medium or a high or where the threshold is. But that's the hardest part. So a key here is we went deeper into enterprise risk management, and this really does give a step-by-step approach to you figuring out within your enterprise where is that risk tolerance threshold, helps you make decisions. So it really fills a missing link to a lot of other guidances. And then very excited about our food fraud advanced criminology and investigation MOOC. This is developed with OPSIN, the Operation OPSIN team. That's Interpol, Europol group. The idea came up from the members there and the attendees. We developed over the course of a year, and it will be published and available later in 2022. Then we also have two MOOCs that were funded through the Organic Trade Association by the U.S. Department of Agriculture on organic fraud and the criminal mind, and preventing organic product fraud. Those go into a lot more details. Even though it's organic, it could be covering all products. Then we have executive education, and post-COVID, we're starting to do a lot more of those. So see our website for that. And on the right is the food fraud textbook. So that's developed as a desk reference as well as a read. You could go all the way through from start to finish. It walks you through the process. So from melamine to infinity, what do we mean by that? So a lot of times in the past, when we were looking at very specific types of actions and applying either food science or basic criminology concepts, the problem we had is that all the food fraud incidents looked so different. So if it was horse meat and beef, then you couldn't apply that to pork and beef or different things like that. Or all of a sudden it was stolen goods. So let's look at melamine was the start, and now we've got just this infinite, seemingly infinite number of incidents. So food fraud vulnerabilities, they are rapidly evolving, but they always have. The food fraud threats are constantly changing, but they always have. Food fraud countermeasures and control systems need to constantly evolve. This is something that we know because they always have. And then really for financially efficient to financially efficiently apply research, investigation, countermeasures, control systems, there needs to be a precise focus on the specific fraud opportunities, not the general problem of food fraud. So we've got a combination here, is that we've got to look at not just all fraud, we need to specifically look at the type of fraud, but we don't want to go, so type of fraud being adulterant substances or species swapping, but not go so deep that we're only looking at horse. We want to look at all types of species swapping. So there's this kind of middle ground where we need to be, but they always have. We've always needed to have this focus. So for whatever project you're working on or the project that funds you, start by understanding the fraud opportunity of specific problems. Then you can calibrate your work to be immediately useful, and that's a key. So many times a lot of work gets conducted and it really doesn't help decision making, and that's a shame. It's a waste. So the scope of food fraud prevention. Let's get into this real briefly. It's interesting that I for a while I stopped covering this, and then people reminded me that there was people that were new to the field, so we need to cover this, if only briefly. So defining food fraud. Think about this as a science and technology conference. We're looking at food authenticity testing. A lot of times it's testing for the presence or the absence of something, a substance. Either it's diluted, it's substituted, or other types of issues. It's replaced, and that's adulterant substances. But really, we need to look for food fraud at all. We need to consider all food fraud. And so it's intentional deception for economic gain using food, any type of deception. So adulterant substances are part of that, but we also need to consider stolen goods. We could protect 100% of the adulterant substances, but all of a sudden there's stolen goods or something else going on, and it counterfeits in the market, and the market is still just as dangerous. The motivation is economic gain for themselves, for the fraudster, and that's where we focus. Things we put in place, we want to make their lives more difficult. We want to make it increase the risk of getting caught or the cost of conducting the crime. Now, food fraud, just it's important to note, is different than food defense. And so food defense, the motivation is traditionally harm or terror, trying to harm someone else. So if someone puts glass in some product and it harms the company, it's economic loss for that company, but it's not economic gain for the fraudster, and that's a real key. In the U.S., we have a shift in focus. And that focus is for the intentional adulteration rule. That's a Food Safety Modernization Act rule. It's one narrow part of it, very specific requirements that's limited to wide-scale harm to public health. Now, a lot of people focus on that and think that they've got all food defense covered. That's not true because it's only wide-scale harms, not things like disgruntled employees, but also some people think that covers all intentional acts, including food fraud, which it doesn't. Now, when we consider the effect, there's always an economic threat, but there's not always a public health threat. But there is always a vulnerability, meaning if anybody's messing with our product in any way, there could be a problem. So along the way, the public health agencies, such as US FDA, focused on the health harms. When there wasn't a health harm, it became a lower priority, naturally. So the key there is the food industry then looked at this and said, you know what, we just need to deal with it. We need to deal with these vulnerabilities because they do lead to threats. They're costly and they can threaten the business and threaten consumers. So that's where the actions occurred. So address all food fraud, or fraudsters will just adapt and just go around you. That's a key. So that's why we need to think about all types of fraud, even though we're a science and technology association here, and we need to focus on those type of tests. The role of science and technology. So let's get into this. So the target audience are laboratories, testing service companies, company internal laboratories, researchers that are looking at new test methods or equipment development. We want to help them to be efficient with their resources, whether it's time, financial, laboratory time, things like that. So one thing that is coming out is a working paper, is a forthcoming report on food fraud prevention, a global perspective on testing, monitoring, and verification. So it provides insight on how the food fraud authenticity concepts are related, looking at testing, monitoring, verification, and you'll see this with the LGC program, the Dr. E series. So you'll see a link there for that in their standards. So this is going to go into a lot more detail of all the things I'm talking about. What we're talking about when we're looking at science and technology is, well, what's the role? We need to step back and look at the big picture. So detect, deter, and prevent. So authentication is definitely a key to food fraud prevention and critical part of this whole continuum. And what we've got at the beginning is detection, or to detect. It's finding that specific adulterant substance or product anomaly, something that's different about the product. That's the role of science and technology. But that's within the framework of not only detection, but thinking about deterrence or to deter. Those are targeted countermeasures to stop one specific type of fraud act or fraudster. So we're looking at overall, we need to be able to detect melamine in skim milk powder. Okay, that's detect. But we're trying to deter it. We're not just trying to catch it. So we need to then apply those tests in a way that fraudsters know we have those tests being conducted. And with that occurring, then the fraudsters will fear that they could get caught. So there's the difference there. We don't just develop the test, but we think about the implementation, but not only implementation that's efficient for us, but efficient for communicating to them. And that leads to big picture, to prevention or to prevent. It's the application of those countermeasures that reduce the fraud opportunity. So let's say that you are a laboratory for a food company and you start to test for melamine, then you start to test for horse meat. Then you start to look at different types of anomalies. Maybe it's like a viscosity change. You find out that some type of oil that's been replaced looks at viscosity. Well, you're now looking more broadly at an entire program looking at preventing fraud. And that's the key. People that sell to you will start to understand you've got a lot of different things going on. All those separate activities, as long as they're coordinated, can lead to prevention. And if you take a focus on overall prevention, you can maybe make some little tweaks to the system that vastly reduce your fraud opportunity. So selecting the right test, method, and sampling plan. Oh, so key. Because well, like there's reports coming out, or someone does a report and pulls 50 samples from a country. Well, are those 50 samples representative of the entire country? Can you draw some conclusions? Well, if all you did is test at one retailer or one manufacturing site or one type of product, say you bought all the product off Craigslist or off eBay or off one of the auction sites, commercial consumer auction sites, that's not representative of the entire market. The other side of that is if you tested only from the highest level certified, reviewed, audited companies, that also wouldn't be representative of the entire country. So this was a chapter I wrote on specifically selecting those right methods and sampling plan. So the single technical solution, picking a single technical solution, hoping it's a magic solution to prevent fraud is really easy. So you say, well, I got to pick something, we pick it. But technology is only one of the many aspects of the anti-counterfeit and food fraud prevention strategies. The solutions to food fraud prevention are systems-based, not tools. They must include what is referred to as a layered approach. So we look at things like, say that it is that melamine test. There's a couple different tests for melamine that can then detect different types of the processes used along the way. You have to decide where to test, when to test, how to communicate it, how to respond to it, how to put those plans in place, how to have negative consequences for suppliers. So it's not just a supplier shows up and has a positive melamine test and you just turn them away. There's got to be some type of consequence, such as sometimes people have that they then seize the product and turn it over to, if it crosses the border, turn it over to customs. Well, all of a sudden, then you as a company are not liable for that product if you turn it over to customs because it's government seizure. That's outside your control. And then when the government seizes it, they could destroy it. And all of a sudden, then the government now knows, those import agencies know the problem with that one company. So you've gone from just detecting it and stopping using it to doing something else. And that's looking at that layered approach. So in another article, I covered the role of public-private partnership and the role of science and technology. This was a really key to dig in a little further. And here we really are saying we need to take a holistic view of what's actually needed, not just more. If you do one test is great, or two better, four better, five better. Is one aspirin good? Then is 4, 5, 10 better? Well, not necessarily. And when we look at this, we look at it from a medical standpoint, and we've got the idea of what's the problem, and then what's the test, method, sampling plan, and monitoring verification program. Along the way, we're looking at this is thinking about this like you going to the doctor. If you've got a headache, the first thing they do is not give you cancer medicine. So you're thinking about diagnosis, treatment, prognosis, and then making a decision there at the end. So what's going wrong? And then if we apply this risk treatment, will it actually help? There's some times where if you start to test for something, the fraudsters might go right around it. So you might decide that having a risk treatment, you might decide that less testing, less traceability is more efficient for your system if it's not helping. But the key is you're not just stopping and not doing anything. You're taking those resources and applying someplace else where they're much more efficient. And that's a key, thinking about the big picture, not just a diagnosis. We found melamine in infant formula, not just a treatment of doing melamine tests wherever. You think about the impact overall, the prognosis, the outcome. All three of those together lead you to make the decision. So, this has been really frustrating for a lot of entities. Is the implementation is really a question of scale when we're looking at food fraud prevention. So along the way, I think at the very beginning, say right after horse meat, there was a flurry of activities, conferences, things going on, all about food fraud. And I think there were a lot of laboratories or related enterprises that thought that food fraud testing was going to be food safety times 2. So think about all the testings that's done for food safety in one manufacturing plant. There might be, let's just say, 100 tests a day. So that's for food safety. But for food fraud, their thought was it would be times 2 because they considered it was the same type of system. But it's not. Prevention with these human adversaries is very different. So the example here is looking at detect. So if you know there's a problem such as heavy metals in a product or salmonella in something, then in those 2 products out of 5, you would test a ton. But for these other items, say there's a kill step or there's not been a known type of problem, then for those B, C, and E, you wouldn't do any tests. That's for detect. So for food fraud, that would be the same way. Let's say that it is not a food safety incident, but let's say it's species testing that's rampant or species fraud that's rampant and something else. Then you may go deep in those 2 topics if you're trying to detect. The key is there, when horse meat was in the product across Europe, people did 100% testing. They tested multiple parts of a pallet because they were trying to detect. Detection is deep in only a few products. Now next is to look at deter. It's lighter, but in a range of products. So what we see here is that once the horse meat incident has passed, then, still for item A, let's say that's ground beef, you'll still do quite a bit of testing, or some testing anyway. But then all of a sudden you said for item B, maybe that's ground turkey. And all of a sudden you say, it's still ground meat. Maybe we should we should test for horse a little bit in there. Just a little bit. That's to deter. So if the fraudster is selling, if people generally produce and sell ground beef and ground turkey, then you're looking at deterring a specific type of actor. And then D is some type of other fraud. But once you've got it under control, say that's a dilution of honey with other types of sugars, you're still testing a bit because you see it in the marketplace. It may show up every once in a while. You need to be robust about that because you know it's in the market. Finally is prevention. For prevention overall is very light, but in all products. So here we see this for the entire product slate. Even if you think that product C is not got a lot of fraud, there's great detection tests, great suppliers, you still would want to test just a little bit. But look what we've got across here. The amount of tests, the amount intensity of tests for detection is deep, only in those areas. But if you get things under control for prevention, it's much lighter. So the thing we see is that food fraud testing is not food safety testing times 2. So I was talking about the evolution of looking at food fraud vulnerabilities, and occasionally something will happen, a hot topic that's seems completely out of the blue, but it's been really fascinating along the way to see that applying the same concepts do apply. So and they work. So we're looking at the management system in action. And this is assessment of Ukraine, Russia. And it was actually 7 days after Russia had entered Ukraine, completely unknown about the future or anything. I mean, at that point, then it could have been 1 day and Russia completely took over Ukraine. It could have been 1 day that Russia left Ukraine, exited the country without any incident. No idea. So how to deal with food fraud? The thing that was great is when we got through this, cycled through it, applied the vulnerability assessments with as much information as we had. We looked at different scenarios. There were some very clear actions that could occur later that day. Actually, even during one of the calls, one of the ideas is that, saying the product from Ukraine, such as sunflower oil, other types of specialty oils, specifically sunflower oil was the question, that there was a thought that, okay, whatever's happening, there's going to be some disruption in global supply. Well, that moment the quality control manager or whoever it was, they could send a note to their group to confirm that the olive or the sunflower oil authenticity dilution tests were in place, that the weights of trucks were continuing to monitored and things like that. Just confirming that you're really doing the processes you already have in place. That could happen immediately. That did happen immediately. So once those companies put those in place, even though, look, it was 7 days after the invasion, some people estimate it was going to be a year before any fraudulent product got through the marketplace and into commerce. But still, on day one, they were able to do things that vastly reduced their fraud opportunity with the information that we had, and that's a real key. So we'll cover that and present a little bit of that. So the base event, Ukraine-Russia. So it's clear that an event like Ukraine-Russia creates tremendous supply chain disruptions and stressors that vastly increase the fraud opportunity. Now, at this point, we didn't know what they would be, but just that much change. And then Russia had the, they couldn't export product, couldn't import product, things like that causes a lot of disruptions. And so we looked at scenarios because you knew it was happening right now, but no one knew what was going to happen in another day or week or month. And now we've got, going on a year. So one scenario, extreme, yes, but one scenario was that the recovery of ag and food production is undefined, and the scenario could be 10 years. And on day 14 of that, the Russia entering Ukraine, that seemed really crazy. But now that we see that the battle didn't go across all of Ukraine as of the date of my discussion here, but in the far east of Ukraine, there's a lot of activity going on. And if anything, there's human waste, human activity in the middle of a lot of those very productive fields. So it's going to take a while for those fields to be cleared of mines, cleared of trash, any other biological matter before they're going to be as productive as they can be. So one scenario was all of Ukraine production was gone for 10 years. And the reporting of novel food fraud incidents often lags weeks, months, since the gathering and sharing of information is very methodical, formal, thorough, and legal. So 7 days, 14 days, a month in, we are not going to see incidents show up. It would be very, very uncommon to see a lot of the incidents show up in a very public way. Now, of course, here and there, a report of this truck here, this and there, what's going on, yeah, individual incidents. But to have broad data sharing, think about it, in Ukraine or at the borders of Ukraine, in the midst of day 14 of this, people aren't focused on measuring the border crossing product. It's immediate defense. So we don't expect to get a lot of the criminal data until later, and that's common with crime. Partially, it's called the dark figure of crime, where a lot of crime is just not reported, or it's reported in ways that are hard to find in data sets. And specific food fraud incidents usually take a while to be found since the nature of the clandestine act is stealthy and clandestine. So the usual food system monitoring systems will not work. Where to start? And that's the question. So just to look at data, there's not going to be data at that point. But we know inherently the fraud opportunity has changed. That's this whole idea of the evolution of the vulnerability assessments, to be in place to put things in action right now that are efficient. Now, we didn't say to do a lot, and we didn't say spend a lot of money. And one of the things is that just to confirm that your company does have the ability to conduct sunflower oil authentication tests or check for dilution, and to confirm that those programs are in place. Now, maybe it costs money to increase the number of tests. Maybe you don't increase it 100 times on day one, but at least you know what's there and you start to monitor. Start with the current issues and then track scenarios. And that's what we did. And that's what you do with business. That's what you do with supply chain disruptions. You see the current state, you look at the key factors, and then you adjust over time to see how they've changed. The methodology we used. So this overall idea of supply chain disruptions, the actual disruption itself was totally and completely uncertain. It was amazing to read some of the estimates from economists, and the biggest thinkers in the world had no idea. So the traditional resources and responses to food fraud prevention may be outdated. So one thing is, let's say that you look in a food fraud incident database and you find a product that has a lot of fraud produced in Ukraine. Well, As time goes by, there's not production in Ukraine. There's not massive exports. If that product was on the border there in Russia, there's a lot less production there. There's a lot less export. So the entire landscapes needed to be reviewed. And what we did here is we started backwards, and at the very bottom right is the beginning point. And usually when we see supply chain disruptions, we look at this whole idea of the very specific incident. Let's say melamine in skim milk powder. Now, beyond that, we a lot of times don't have to go up to scenarios because we know what occurred. We know where it occurred, how it occurred, and then when you're receiving skim milk powder, then you can do those tests, especially if the product is judged by protein content, which was the case with melamine. But all of a sudden, then, when we looked at food fraud as a specific question for Ukraine, Russia, we had to go back and look at the scenarios. There's not one scenario. A lot of times we don't even think that we're doing scenario planning because there's just one scenario. But we had to think about all these different things that it could occur. Again, what product is stressed? What about exports from Russia, imports from Russia? A big concern is fertilizer, nitrogen, potassium, things like that. So we need to look at scenarios that could lead to ripple effects as well. We need to identify where we had a lot of unknowns. To then develop those scenarios, we had to go one step up, and that's looking at the event. And usually we don't have to look at some bigger event. So in this case, we did have to look at the event. And we looked at what caused the disruption, and that is Russia in Ukraine and all that activity going on. It's also thinking about across Russia over time is conscription. So all of a sudden, people from farms, farm workers were drawn off farms. Manufacturing facilities could be losing people. So that led to other types of events that changed the scenarios, that changed the supply chain disruption. And then even more rare is to go beyond those events to look at the very base. And this is looking at the basics of geopolitical issues and the basics of production and those details. And that's at the very core. And I think as we've got to November, then boy, there's some like global geopolitical restructuring that probably is going to occur. So all of a sudden, then those feed into the event, the scenario, and supply chain disruption. The key is we need to make action today. We're looking at the big picture, think about what happened a year out, 2 years out, 5 years out, but we're worried about it right now. We're looking at the product that you're going to be receiving on your dock. What should you be worried about? How should you be responding? And that's the key. Is at this point, then we did again those simple things like look for dilution of sunflower oil. Now, if we look at the scenario being longer, another activity that occurred was communicating to research and development groups that if you're using sunflower oil, look for an alternate, more common type of oil. Maybe sunflower oil was a specialty oil. Maybe it reduced cholesterol, did something like that. But the recommendation is to shift some product development because, again, one of those scenarios, improbable but true, but a realistic scenario was 10 years before the Ukrainian sunflower production could be back. So that's a real difference here. Now the key is this is all a part of food fraud prevention vulnerability assessments. We just don't usually dig back farther, but we have the processes there as long as we look at them and implement them. So the call to action. Overall, again, for the EFFoST conference is we're looking at food science, food authenticity, and that's the role in food fraud prevention, and specifically that role of science and technology. But as well as investigation and prosecution should be judged by the contribution to prevention. That's a real key. We're not just trying to catch it, we're trying to prevent it. And if there's not a defined fraud opportunity or an overall vulnerability assessment, then the countermeasures and control systems are no more than a guess. This would be an educated, intellectual best guess, but a guess nonetheless. So let's say Ukraine, Russia, that you're thinking of, oh, what products? What should we test for? Then without this deeper analysis, then you're just guessing. So now, of course, to do things like immediately on day one to look at authenticity tests or things like that, then you just implement them. But we'll take the next step to really understand the fraud opportunity. So what's going on here? Is it all dilution of sunflower oil? Maybe there's a different oil that gets gets, if let's say that cashew oil, which I imagine is a lot more expensive, but let's say cashew nut oil is the substance used for dilution. Then if we do understand the fraud opportunity and that being the product, then we can also test for the presence of cashew nut oil. So there again is a key, is once we have more information, we go beyond a best guess or a guess itself to really looking at the actual fraud opportunity. You need to understand the root cause. Why is this fraud act occurring? Why is there dilution in sunflower oil? Why is there melamine in infant formula? Once we understand that, and such as for melamine, it was to deceive the protein tests. For if we had this hypothetical cashew oil in sunflower oil, it was to dilute the sunflower oil. We're understanding the root cause. It's either that premium for the higher protein skim milk powder, or for just having enough sunflower oil. Understand how the bad guy will evolve. This is not E. coli, and once you have a kill step, it's done. The fraudsters will continue to evolve. So let's say we get great at testing for, well, it was melamine, and all of a sudden there was innovation later. What's the next melamine that could come out to deceive the protein tests? We should expect there to be something next. You're scientists. You figure out what you would do next to deceive the test. That's a great way to stress test it. That's a hackathon if you're looking at computer systems. The same with sunflower oil, that if we get really good at testing for the cashew nut oil, there'll be something else in there as well. How will they evolve so we can stay one step ahead? Expect them to evolve. Explain your solution in terms of prevention, not just more is better or you should do something. Now, if you do present your science and technology, countermeasures, control systems, not in terms of just we can detect sunflower oil, but here's what else we're doing. Here's how it prevents. Here's how to do the sampling plan. Now you're helping people really, really make an impact, and that's where you're the most valuable. A lot of acknowledgments. I'm really, really thankful for this group. You've been great for a lot of the journal articles. You've got great journals. It's been fantastic to publish with you. I look forward to doing it in the future. I look forward to interacting with you again. It was a great I'm looking forward to a great conference. With that, in the conference, we'll take discussion. Here's my contact information. I have it here because I want to hear from you. You can look for more information at foodfraudprevention.com, and also our MOOCs, those free online courses, are available at foodfraudmooc.com. Thank you. Have a great day.